because there's no bad exercises. There's only bad positions.
Welcome to the Think Fitness Life podcast, where we bring the mind, body, and gym together so you can improve your health, increase performance, and live your best life. For more information, visit thinkfitnesslife.com. Here are your hosts, Matt Gluckman and Eric Menchie.
This week we're talking about hips and ankles. Last week we covered neck and shoulders. It was super important because we talked about how about we process from the top down. But unfortunately, problems kind of arise from the bottom up. Typically, we do have problems that stem from our ankles or from our hips. More importantly, kind of like the way our foot is associated with the ground. We'll go over that as well today. When we wear a shoe, we can tend to have like a prosthetic, and we don't get good usage out of those muscles. And then the rest of the leg doesn't know how to orient itself or how to engage properly, so that we have a good support of our spine from our pelvic floor all the way up to our head and neck. But let's go back, and we're going to start actually with the hips. So the hip range of motion, we have flexion, extension, we have internal rotation, external rotation. We have, this is internal rotation. When it rotates in like that, that's external rotation. This is a abduction or a deduction coming in and a abduction going away. Major problem is tightness around the hips and getting stuck in certain positions. We'll talk a little bit about what happens when you have overly mobile hips, but the big piece here is that the hips are supporting your spine from the bottom up. Everything is at your pelvic floor. Your hips have like a hole in the bottom of your pelvis, and all that muscle coming together is your pelvic floor, and that's what you're trying to engage, so that it lights up your core, your abdominal cylinder from the bottom up. So, basically our brain stem, our head is sitting on our spine, and our spine is sitting on our hips, quite frankly. Now, I know we talked about the importance of processing for the body from the neck up, but the big thing with the hips is that we can have such imbalances, and then it can affect the rest of our system. So, for example, if I have a strong glute on my right side and a weak glute on my left side, I could have a deviation where I have less support on my left side, so then I have almost like a scoliosis or a shift in the way that my hip sits, my spine sits, my vertebrae sit, and that's really important because if I'm doing any axial loading, if I'm loading my spine, whether I'm holding on to weight, loading spine, or putting it on my back, that's going to cause an imbalance if my system's not neutral. And we talked about injuries. The number one injury is previous injury. Or number one predictor of injury is previous injury. The number two predictor of injury is imbalance. So it's super important to adjust our hips, because that's usually where we can kind of correct a lot of these imbalances. The common issues that we see with the hip, and Eric, I'd like you to chime in here too with what you see, is lack of a pelvic floor. Just being able to engage or find that, even being able to do like 10 minutes of breathing exercises and still being like, I'm not sure if I feel it. That's pretty common. Overactive quads, creating an imbalance in the whole hip dynamic, really tugging on and pulling those hips down forward and causing a more compression at the lower back and the rectors of the lower spine there. And then like lack of a glute med TFL in abducting the leg properly. Does that kind of sum up a lot of the common issues you see, or what are some other ones that I missed?
That's the most common, because we're upright against gravity. We do have a tendency to have an anterior pelvic tilt bias, and because we're asymmetrically built, we have a tendency to be more right side dominant. So our hips get shifted into that right side, and all that leads to hip position is pelvic floor dysfunction. And if you think pelvic floor dysfunction, you have to think about core dysfunction. And if you're training, working out, running, doesn't matter what you're doing, competing at a point where you don't have control of a pelvic floor, you're just not going to have optimal performance. And that's what really leads hip problems. And a lot of things If you have a foot problem, it's a hip problem. If you have a knee problem, it's most likely a hip problem. And that's what kind of starts things to go down and up the chain of what we're looking at from a pelvic positional standpoint. And as you mentioned, once those glutes are off, then other muscles will figure out how to pull us forward, move us forward, backs, hip flexors, quads, very, very common. But overall, at the end of the day, I always tell people we're human, we're designed and built like this. We need to understand that innately we have these futures because we are bipedal. We walk on 2 feet. So we have to understand that and always address that. It's not like some people don't have them. Most people do have some sort of hip position because we're against gravity. We need to address that, get them so they can move through all ranges of motion. So, like you said, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, IR, ER at a pelvic level, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people experience tightness in these areas, the pelvic region, the hip region in general, and they think that, because it's tough to tell when you have a muscle that's tight because it's overactive or because it's weak, but typically that's what's happening is these are weak muscles that that maintain tension because the opposite side of the system is stronger, so it pulls. Because we've talked about this before, our body's a tensegrity structure, and the fact that it has constant tension is what gives it structural integrity. So if I have constant tension and I have weakness on one side, it's going to always be tight because it's being pulled by the stronger side. So usually what happens is everything in the anterior is really strong and the posterior is weak. So we feel tightness in the posterior, whether it's glute med, it's piriformis, and then it stems into the lower back, pulling on the lower back erectors in the QL, some of the core musculature that can lead to a hyperextension of the lumbar spine.
Because it
Um,
flips. You have like the lower half of the body will be anteriorly tight, and then when you go up the chain, you lose that position of the hips. You lose abdominal muscles to oppose and hold position. You get lower back, and at the end of the day, right? Why things get tight in tone is literally so we can stand upright and keep ourselves from falling over. We can do
yeah.
activities like drive a car, do all these things because our brain is literally protecting us to say, you need to stand upright. If your hips are too far forward, I need these hamstrings to be strong, right? But they're in a lengthened position. So try to be strong as you can. They're going to tighten up. Lower back's going to tighten up to hold you in that upright position. And that's how mechanistically our brains work. It's like it's finding tension somewhere in that system that you just mentioned to deal with life that we live.
And that's why it'll always be a better choice to be a smart lifter than a strong lifter. We can always power through things. There's a level to which we can have the grit and just power through things. But if you're someone who's experienced a reoccurring familiar pain, discomfort in the same lifts in the same spot over and over again, it's time to be the smart lifter, and you got to program your system accordingly. It's not going to be good to go at 300 pounds or 200 pounds and fire appropriately. You need to start on the ground, do some pelvic floor exercises. You're basically trying to layer in the proper tension and the proper muscles for the major lift. We talked about different activation exercises, warm up activation exercises. We've put the plank circuit up on our reels recently, and it got a ton of views. I think it's because people miss out on that stuff. They miss out on priming the system before it goes, and it's as little as doing a pelvic breathing exercise for 10 breaths on the ground in like an anterior pelvic anterior tilt, and then progressing that to a 90-90 breathing exercise, and then progressing that to a squat hold, body weight squat hold, where you're doing an anterior pelvic tilt and posterior pelvic tilt exercise. And now squat with the bar, now squat with tension. And you should feel yourself being able to maintain that pelvic floor throughout that. But I think so many people just go in and they're like, they hear what muscle they need to engage, and they just want to strengthen it like a bicep curl. They just want to hit it real hard with a couple reps and that muscle beyond. It doesn't always work that way, and it is about kind of neural processing. We're trying to train better instincts. You take a lift like the Olympic lift, and there are so many technical components to each stage of the lift. You're not cognitively there thinking through the whole lift. It's you're layering it in, workout after workout, week after week to create better instincts. That's the same thing with movement quality and moving appropriately so that the smaller muscles are keeping the system in the proper position so that the larger muscles can do the work and take the tension and let you see results without hurting yourself or getting to a point where you have discomfort performing that exercise or that workout again. So I think a few take-home stretches I'd like to start with the hips is first one is just a half kneeling stretch. You can do it on a step, you can do it on a wall. This is the first place to start to really start to loosen up any muscles associated with your tight hips. The next one is a pigeon stretch.
And I always want to kind of retract on, you mentioned pelvic floor exercises. People, a lot of times they get like, oh, I don't know what that is, or it sounds stupid. And sometimes you can't really feel the pelvic floor. It's hard. But once you have the abs on, then if you have the hips in the right position, you will get a pelvic floor to contract appropriately with the abs. And I think like what we just said, if you look at the plank series we did the other day, right? That is all a pelvic floor warm-up program. If you have the hips in the right position, slightly closer to your chest, those are pelvic floor exercises. And I think that's where people get confused because there's not like certain exercises for the pelvic floors. If you get into a glute bridge and have the abs and those hips tucked under, glutes on, you're going to have.
Yeah, and a lot of it is just positions. So I like to have people on the ground to start engaging that pelvic floor and then moving to a half kneeling position to a standing position and then being able to keep a pelvic floor engagement like in a squat or in a hinge. But then you want to do a Buddha squat. You'll feel some tension dissipate at your lower back. But again, these are going to help open up your hips so you can get to the next part, which is probably the more important part, proper activation and use of the hips. So I like to make things simple to start, and then we can progress things accordingly. If you have one of those bands, it's a really good idea to wrap one of those bands around your knees, just below your knees. But you'll go into like a clamshell position. You're at a 90-90 on your side now. I'd come up into a side plank position. Your knee can be on the ground. Your bottom knee can be on the ground. Your top knee is going to want to abduct away, and you're keeping your foot on the ground. And you can hold this position if you have that band so you can feel that constant tension, or you can do some reps here and feel the outside glute working, and you'll feel the same spot working, holding you up on the one that's facing the ground. And do
Yep.
10 reps on each side. This is just known as the clamshell. This is going to help activate our glute med because, again, that's usually what's missing in the stability side. We talked about what happens when people have tight hips versus hypermobile hips. A lot of it comes down to needing the right tension in the right place, again, so that our femur stays in the right position, so that our glute can take most of the work, so that our core can stay engaged properly and take most of the work, rather than any smaller muscles that cause lower back pain or
And
hip
on
pain.
that one, that exercise, where people get that one wrong is if you have an arched back with the clamshell or an anterior pelvic tilt, that exercise is garbage. You will not get a glute med on. You will feel IT bands and TFLs do all the work. And if Matt's in the position, you can go back and watch it. On that bottom side, that glute med and his left ab wall is holding him up. When he opens that leg up, he's getting glute max ER fibers and some hamstring bicep femoral fibers to open that up. So you are training posterior glute med and glute max on the right side, the legs is lifting, and on the downside, you're training that leg in stance. But you have to have that hip tucked under. If not, you are not training the right pattern. So you're in extension. You're going to get those muscles to fire. And that's the most important thing because there's no bad exercises. There's only bad positions or positions that won't turn on the right muscles. And I think that's where people get lost is you could do clamshells to your blue in the face. And if you have an arch in your back, that is not targeting any neuromuscular pattern that's going to change anything.
Yeah, that's a really good
Well,
point.
people have to be very, very careful when they're doing these mobility or warm up or exercises, that patterns and positions are the most important thing. You don't just put a band on and just start flapping your legs around. Like, it has to be intentional. And you really want to feel the certain muscles engaged that you're looking for.
And thank you for that extra emphasis, because it's so true. Like, just because I'm even showing it doesn't mean I'm activating it properly. You have to really feel the muscles working accordingly. And next time I'll be sure to have like a diagram up there so that we can show people specifically where the muscle is that we're trying to engage. Let's move into the ankle, unless there's anything I missed, Eric. Was there anything that I missed that you wanted to touch on?
No, I think we at some point we'll do a squatting tutorial, but when squatting, just make, if you want, like, if you're doing a warm up, squeeze something between your knees. That'll turn the pelvic floor on as you're doing a warm up and squatting. If you want the pelvic floor on, and then same thing, just be careful as you're squatting. We're not in extension, right? Extension will throw the hips off. I would say that's just going to be a emphasis to really understand where your body is in space and what you're feeling. Like you said, the muscles on is the most important thing.
So really want to feel those glutes firing, those glutes handling the work, not your hips and not your lower back. If it feels like it's in your bone that's holding the structure, and it's tiring, and you need to take a break very often, then you're probably doing something wrong. When it's in the glutes and you can actually feel that big cushiony muscle burning, then you're doing it right. And then core, when a specific spot of your core, I like to mention the belt band, kind of like below your belly button. When you can feel that waistband of core musculature, it's usually because you have your pelvic floor engaged. I've seen a lot of people who can engage up here with the core, but they can't get that deep belly core engagement, and it is associated with a little bit of pelvic floor weakness. So the ankle range of motion, we have dorsiflexion. If I'm dorsiflexion would be flexing my toes toward my knees. Plantar flexion would be pushing my toes away. Inversion is when I turn my toe in, and eversion is when I turn my toes out away from my midline. So that's kind of our four ranges of motion of the ankle and the foot. Again, the biggest part of the role of the foot is just our proprioception to activating the rest of the system. They talk about even when we walk, each foot and each leg is responsible for 1.5 times of our full body weight, because what we're doing when we're walking is it's a controlled fall. So you have to think that my whole system is relying on 1 foot on the outside of my midline, and then 1 foot on the opposite side of my midline. And from those steps, everything else up the leg is activated. All the proprioceptors, all the little sensors in our feet that tell the rest of the body what to engage are at the bottom of our foot. So, when we're addressing with movement quality, when we're trying to clean up a movement pattern or fix a problem or get out of pain, discomfort, I like to get people out of their shoes. It's usually newer for their body, and it's usually the best corrective, because it opens up their brain to be more aware of the nuances of the foot, rather than just feeling like, I'm on the ground, I'm stabilized, and having bad movement patterns. I think in terms of the most common issues that are associated with the foot, I'd say we have like hip drop, so just having no arch whatsoever, having just a flat foot, having tight ankles or Achilles, having tight calves, having inversion, and creating outside hip pain, and then shin splints. All those tend to start at the foot itself. So,
Right. But they are a problem at the hip first. And I think that's the big issue, because all those things, those itises, that shin splints, all those, it's a hip problem. Like you said, if you're trying to get a flat foot or a collapsed foot, that is because up the chain, so flat foot is internal rotation or pronation, up the chain, somewhere up in that hip, that you're not getting internal rotation in. And I think that's a big thing that a lot of people miss when it comes to the foot. So then they just put orthotics in and they're like, it feels better to a certain degree, but they never address the hip. And this is why the foot and hip go hand in hand, literally in this
Right.
spot, because the feet are going to try to get any range of motion that the hips don't have. So if you have a shin splint, it's most likely because that pelvis is out of position up top, and your anterior tibialis is now trying to externally rotate that leg instead of your glute max up above, and it is pulling. The definition of shin splint, a splint is to keep something rigid. That anterior tib is trying to keep that rigid so you can't have movement. That's why we get a lot of pain. So when you think feet, always think hips above that. And if you see flat feet, it's usually something going on upstairs or even higher in the brain that says, why did this person create a flat foot? Why did this person have a high arch? That's just it's telling you an adaptation of what the system above is trying to figure out, which is like walking, running, moving, sitting. It's all just adaptations.
And there's different exercises that we can do to correct for the built up tension in this area. A lot of built up tension in our foot, in our ankle, from just being in a prosthetic, from being in a shoe all the time, that creates this kind of lack of proper usage of the whole foot, and then lack of activation from up the rest of the chain. And any deviation is going to just cause a problem. So,
Yeah,
oh,
and with like a lot of those exercises, right? If you're the tension above the system, right? Because you mentioned, we're talking about tensegrity. If there's too much tension above coming down the system, the ankle won't unlock. So as he's going forward, his hip is in flexion, his knee is in flexion, his ankle is in flexion. If we were to lock him into extension somewhere, right? So he won't have that range of motion because there's tension going to limit that. And that's what comes down to range of motion through the body. It's just trying to figure out, can the body stay upright and not fall over and go into these ranges of motion. And that's why when we're stretching the feet, or no, stretching the feet or mobilizing the feet, a lot of the stuff we did for the hip can be done prior to the ankle, because that's going to allow the pelvic floor to open up, which will allow that foot to get better range of motion, because we've now reset the system for neutrality, so it can go from side to side and have the ranges of motion. You're going to get more out of a hip, right? And that's all that we're looking for, to open up that range of motion: IR, ER, pronation, supination, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion at the hip, so someone can have access to those range of motion. So when they go play a sport, when they get on a court or ice, they can access range of motion to be able to perform what they need to do.
and this is the other stretch that I was going to talk about, was having your toe elevated with this knee drop position, because that's going to actually help floss another muscle that's tight, that's associated with the calf, and can prevent you from getting good ankle mobility. So getting this knee drop going over your toe, again, you can have a band at your ankle pulling from behind you to help get that extra range of motion and break up that subtalar joint, so you can get that knee over that toe. But then put like a tennis ball or something to elevate your toe. That'll actually also help you grab more of the ground through that arch. But then there's different exercises you can do with arch building. You can start with like a toe elevated and come down into a squat and try to hold this position for 30 seconds to a minute on each leg. Super important to address the arches. And
Arches are
another,
super important because you need internal rotation. You need to have an arch when you run. So we go heel strike, arch, pull, toe off. You have to have an arch. So in training, we like to find arches really quick for people. Go back to squatting with the ball. If you get IR through femurs, which opens up the pelvic floor, you're going to get IR through the floor, through the arches. So anything, even if it's 90-90, and you have something between your knees, you're creating IR, your brain's going to sense internal rotation coming through the whole lower system, which is going to give you internal rotation through the floor. And this is sometimes where people get a little bit messed up on squats, is because they like to ER their legs on squats. That's a mismatch
right,
for their body, because they
right.
should be IRing at certain points. And that's where a lot of people, if you live too much in ER, you got to be very careful, because you're going to limit range of motion into IR.
And what Eric's talking
So
about is
always,
external rotation versus internal rotation. So it's funny because the major fixes today are two opposite sides of the coin. One is putting a band around your legs and having the strengthening of abduction out here, but then the other one is having something in between your knees and having the strength of a deduction, bringing everything inside. Because it's not, again, we've talked about before, it's not one fix for everything. It's not this position's bad and this position's good. It's you need both working synergistically together, pulling together, and doing their separate jobs so that, again, the larger muscles can do the work.
And usually the first step is to gain IR, which will allow ER. But most humans live more in external rotation. It allows us to have a base of support, and that's just natural. It's normal. So creating IR situations first, then training ER, that is the way to go. And that's why in our programs, in our warm-ups, we a lot to do 90-90 hip lifts, a ton first with a ball between the legs, and then guess what? We're going to go to some ER work with a band to get those external rotation fibers in. Because when we look at it from, let's just take running, you need to IR to get mid stance, you need to ER to get push off. So if you don't have IR, you're not going to get mid stance and absorb force. If you don't have ER, you're not going to be fast. So you have to do both. But usually I tell a lot of people, start with IR first, let the body sense that, and then you can move out into ER.
And the last thing that I wanted to talk about are just some more take-home exercises. So if you're struggling with shin splints, for example, you can sit down in a chair and you can take your shoe off and you can curl up a towel with the bottom of your foot, and you can start to pick up a towel with the bottom of your foot. That'll start to activate more of the muscle in the front of the leg and help strengthen that muscle to help prevent the shin splints. And then another one that will help you with just better control of the ankle in general. A lot of times people just have weakness in that muscle in general. So being able to lean up on a wall and they're on their heels and picking up their toes towards their knees, doing like 15 of those little pulse contractions. It's a very small movement, but essentially, everyone knows the rear foot elevated squat when they put their foot on something and they're squatting down. I love the front foot elevated squat.
Yeah. And on that one, if you are quad dominant or feel more quads, it's because they're moving too much vertical, where on that one you move forward because you're starting the ankle in more of a early stance, early propulsive position, so you can move through that range of motion. And that's why I think front foot elevated split squats are better to go to at the beginning of a training program than rear foot, because people have a hard time in late stance, which is a rear foot elevated split squat. That's harder to control because you're asking for more internal rotation control, where the front foot elevated, you can start more in an externally rotated position, move into internal rotation and control it. So you're allowing your system to move through that full excursion of ER to IR and then back. And that's why those are so good. And what it will do is it'll give you do this without a shoe on. And shoes are a big thing, with certain shoes, like Hoka's probably are not the best training shoes for people because they're rocker shoes. They bias certain things. Certain Nikes, that's completely different. But if you do this barefoot or just with socks on, you're going to feel your foot as it moves forward find an arch. And that's what we're looking for your brain to sense. There's an arch, there's a quad, there's a glute, there's a hamstring, there's an ab wall working underneath this side. I can function in this stance to move through. And you'll unlock all these ranges of motion to your body when you go do heavier loaded movements, or you go to run, or you go to sprint and jump. That's the end goal of training. Yeah, we want to get you stronger in those positions because it's going to teach the brain to allow you to access that when you need to. Or even if it's like a grandparent playing on the floor with their grandkid, the ability for them to get into a lunge position to stand up, we're just giving their brain a sense of, do I have a stable hip? Do I have an ankle that can do the same thing that the hip needs to do to lift me off? And that is quality movement of life.
I love it. And that pretty much sums up movement quality. Like I said, we did neck and shoulders last time. We did hips and ankles this time. We don't need to do things like elbows and knees. It's pretty straightforward in terms of flexion extension, and they're not supposed to do too much else. But yeah, our biggest thing is trying to make it specific to the individual. So if there's any questions over this stuff, please don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions. You can comment on this video directly. We'll see that, or you can email us, thinkfitnesslife@gmail.com. the biggest thing is we just try to keep personal training personal. And the only way to do that is managing implementation, progression, regression. So being able to get this whole sense of this industry with kinesiology, with body mechanics, with neuromuscular properties kind of all make sense to the individual at their current position, so that they can take this industry and this field to the places they want to go, whether it's just having great movement quality and being able to participate in all things in life without any worries of pain or discomfort, or being strong to hike with their loved ones, or just participate in extreme sports, see their elevated performance. We're here to make it all happen. Think Fitness Life. Mindset, exercise, nutrition, creating smart athletes, smart individuals to empower themselves and letting them, unleash their full potential by taking care of their bodies. So that'll wrap up today's lecture. I think the big takeaways were internal rotation and external rotation, having a band for tension for that external rotation, and having maybe a ball or a pillow to squeeze in your knees to help strengthen that internal rotation. These are great for activation exercises. These are great for strengthening your body to have the proper position when under load. And then, just grip it and rip it after that. Once you're moving well, test the system out. But yeah, that's about it, and we'll catch you guys next time. Thanks,
If
Eric,
you're
for
ready
joining
to
us.
make steps towards improving your health or increasing your performance, book a free 30-minute call today by visiting thinkfitnesslife.com.